Well, hi there. Now then, this is my latest painting. It's 18 inches by 18 inches. And I've sort of done this with the thought that I can do a video tutorial and sort of share with you the processes and the techniques that I've been trying to hone recently. Okay, let's get on. I've tried to break this down into digestible chunks. So I'm going to show you those basic chunks and then go into more detail on each of them. Firstly, I started by painting a dark outline of the elements. I then painted in very roughly the basic colours I wanted, getting rid of all the white background. And I then messed it all up a bit with fairly random brush strokes. And now this is where the magic starts to happen. We go over it with a fairly large brush, pretty randomly painting brush strokes of white. And the second bit of magic is mixing up colours with acrylic glaze medium and applying it over the top of everything. Finally, we tickle it up a bit, adding shadow areas with acrylic glaze and a little bit of detail where necessary. Voila! Finished painting, job done. Stick it in the gallery. So let's go into more detail about each stage. Okay, so composition-wise, I started with a photograph which I simplified using curved lines to define the shapes of the two faces. If I bring back the photo and superimpose it on top of my line drawing, a bit like tracing paper, you can see I wasn't trying to copy the photo, I was just sort of using it to inspire a design. Very little of it lines up. The curve of the lady's face is very different to the original, as is the shape of the man's head. I've taken the man's thumb out of her ear. Nobody likes a thumb in their ear. My intention was to fill the frame nicely and to lead the eye around the picture. In choosing colours, if you're not directly referencing colours from your source image or photo or whatever it is that has initially inspired you, then try to choose colours that somehow work together. If you use Google Images and search for colour combinations, there are some great colour swatches come up. Another way of choosing colours is to find a painting that you love the colours of and use them for yourself. For instance, looking at one of my own recent paintings of the Minstrel, I based the colours I used on Picasso's painting Girl Before a Mirror. I'm not going to show his painting here for copyright reasons, but suffice to say it's a jolly colourful painting. He was quite good on colour, was old Picasso, so it's a good trick. Now then, having drawn my image out in pencil onto the canvas, I then went over that using Payne's Grey, which is very nearly black but not quite. So next is just basically filling in the main sort of colours and getting rid of any of the white of the canvas. So firstly I mixed up a sort of general skin tone kind of colour and applied it using a fairly fat 1-inch decorating brush. I used the paint neat without watering it down at all and apply it so there's a bit of brush texture making little ridges which are going to build up into quite a textured background layer. Having dried that off with a hairdryer, I then wanted to add more texture on top. Now for that I used a texture medium which I mixed in with the flesh coloured paint. I actually used this extra heavy gel gloss made by Golden, but it would have been fine to use matte gel rather than gloss, doesn't matter. Any sort of texture medium will do. There's quite a few of them on the market, and as the name suggests, it's a material that you mix with paint to change its consistency, in particular to add surface texture to a painting. It's sort of stiffer than paint straight from the tube, so it'll hold its form or shape very, very nicely. I can then apply it to the canvas as I'm doing here with a palette knife, pretty randomly really. This build-up of texture pays off magnificently later in the painting process as subsequent brush marks will snag on this texture and develop into an organic looking paint structure which to me at least has an awful lot going for it visually. And I tend to use this texture with a brush as well as a palette knife just to get a bit of variation. You can see here again I'm using a 1-inch decorating brush for that purpose. So I'll continue with this same process over the rest of the canvas until all the basic colours are in and I've got some good texturing going on. Now I might at this stage, once everything is dry, add a bit more texture with a roller just for a bit of variation. There really is no hard and fast rules of exactly what to do, and if you don't have a roller then it's no problem, although I suppose you could use an old cardboard toilet roller or a wooden stick. It really doesn't matter. I tend to vary what I do from painting to painting. The roller does a really great job at adding interesting bits. It's very easy to apply and it's best used fairly randomly. Likewise, I could have applied some texture medium to an old credit card and then pressed it onto the canvas, sort of repeatedly lifting it off. That too would give an interesting effect. But just have a look at the texture that's been left over on my palette after I've been using the roller. Now that has a wonderfully organic feel to it, doesn't it? And when that's dry, imagine running a brush loaded with a bit of paint over the top of it. The paint will catch on the top ridges and largely fail to sink into the valleys. And it's this sort of technique which will allow the painting to develop a really nice natural textured feel to it, as though the painting sort of happened by some organic accident of nature. I like that kind of stuff. But let's get back to the stage that we got up to. Worth just mentioning here, and you'll see if I flick back and forth between one stage and the next, I've painted back in the dark lines which inevitably get covered over as I progress. So I won't mention every time I repaint in those lines, but you do have to do that several times in order not to lose them. So looking at where we're at, and by the way, the texture gel tends to dry transparent, so you don't really see it here. But when we start applying paint on top, as I say, the paint tends to catch on the hills of the texture and therefore starts to show up interestingly. And all that time spent attending to your texture starts to pay off. And now we're going to go and start messing this painting up a bit. Relax in the knowledge that very little of the paint you're now going to apply will show through at the end of the painting. I'm applying this pretty randomly, mostly with a brush, maybe a bit with a palette knife, putting in colours that are mostly darker shades of what's there, with the odd bit of other colour to spice it up a bit. And important that you let it dry before going over it with another layer, otherwise the paint tends to blend. If there's one bit of wet paint over the top of another, it'll blend in, and that can result in just muddy colours. I use a hairdryer in between putting on the paint. Only takes a few minutes to dry off, and then you can carry on with the next colour. And again, I'm using paint relatively thickly and definitely not diluted with water. So far so good. Now the next bit is where the magic starts to happen. This is where I'm going to break up the image further by brushing across it with white paint using a 2-inch decorating brush. As I said earlier, I could have used a 1-inch brush or 3-inch. I certainly don't give myself hard and fast rules. But what I've found is really quite important for this stage is to use the flat of the brush rather than the tip. As you can see in the video here, I'm making sure that I've got a fair bit of undiluted paint on what I call the flat part of the brush. That way there's plenty of paint as you drag that flat part across the canvas. And because you've earlier made sure that there's a fair bit of texture built up on the canvas, then this white paint just catches on the little hilly bits of that texture and doesn't just produce a solid white shape. It breaks up really nicely. Right, then let's speed this up, otherwise it's going to be like watching paint dry. I wonder who it was that coined that phrase. Somebody who was very bored, probably. Alright, that's enough of that. Where have we got to? So now, let's take the opportunity of flicking back and forth between the stage we're at now and the finished painting. If you look around, you'll see that there are areas that have changed a fair bit, like the lady's hair, and other parts that just need a tickle of the right colour mixed with glaze, and they're finished. For instance, let's have a look at this bottom right hand corner. Again, if I flick between the finished painting and the present stage, have a look at this sleeve down here. All I've done is paint an orangey brown glaze and then a slightly darker glaze for a shadow area, which I've blended in. Job done. Have a look at the hand. I've painted some flesh coloured glaze, then a slightly darker glaze for a shadow area. So what the glaze is doing is colouring up the white areas, but makes virtually no impact on the darker paint, which is exactly what I want it to do. Let's look at another area, the man's hair for instance. Okay, so flicking between the present stage and the finished painting, a blue glaze has affected the white parts with all their interesting texture, but has left the darker parts pretty well exactly how they were. Oh, tickle my coconuts. And while we're at it, his forehead here, just a flesh coloured glaze and then a bit darker glaze to give some shadow form around the outside. So let's have a look at mixing up a glaze, which is really very, very simple. For this painting I used Liquitex Glazing Medium, but there's a number of different ones on the market. Just need to Google Acrylic Glaze Medium and you should be able to buy it from the comfort of your armchair. Now I tend to use it mixing a large ratio of the glaze medium to quite a small ratio of paint. That way it tends to maintain its translucency, which is what you want. Here I'm going to mix just a small amount of cadmium yellow with the glaze, and I'll be applying maybe 3 coats depending on how well it looks like it's covering. And this is a glaze that I'm going to use in the area of the lady's hair. As you can see, the glaze is affecting the light white coloured areas but has little impact on the darker painted bits. Imagine if I hadn't used any glaze medium and I was just painting over the top of those white areas with cadmium yellow. I'd soon be obliterating everything I've built up so far. The glaze over white gives a very pure colour yellow, which I'd get nowhere near achieving otherwise. It also keeps the painting from looking overworked, so that in itself is a very good trick. If things are looking tired and overworked, bring back some white onto the canvas and then start painting on top of that. It's a great way to keep everything fresh with acrylics. Incidentally, it's good to have a look on YouTube at other tutorials about glazing. I've found a way that suits me with glazing, but it's not necessarily the one and only or ultimately correct way to use glaze medium. This is where I'm at now after using 3 coats of glaze on the hair. I also mixed in a bit of green glazing and orange, which I sort of blended in with the yellow. And then it's a case of carrying on in exactly the same way, painting in the other areas with the appropriate colour mixed with the glaze medium. Now time to stand back and just have a think about what is and what isn't working. So I kind of reckoned at this stage that everything is heading in the right direction, but I thought the lady's hair was just looking a bit too wacky. Maybe it needed toning down a bit. Now the truth is that there are times when you have to keep throwing things at a painting. We all know that you can get to a stage where something isn't working. And what do I do when that happens? Reach for the white paint. There you go, splodge. Time to get the hairdryer out. Now, I went through a few little stages trying things out and splodging about until I felt that I was back on track. I think every painting is individual and each one will throw up its own individual challenges, that's for sure. The trick is not to give up. Acrylic paintings can start to look tired and overworked, but as I say, you can keep applying white to maintain a freshness and then work over the top of that. So let's put this bad hair day to bed for the time being. Now, as I'm showing you every tiny little stage, I put a little bit more white in places. For a start, I kind of thought the light should be coming from some direction, in from the top right, so I just added a little more highlight to the man's hair. Going back to the original reference, this is a nod towards where the light was falling. As you can see, it's coming in from top right. So I've kind of highlights of whiter areas on some of the fingers, the woman's face and ear, the man's ear and hair, etc. So I'm just knocking those back to blend in with the original colours, again using paint mixed with acrylic glaze medium. There it is, before and after. The painting's not looking bad, but it's going to be improved by painting in some shadow areas. First, the shadows on the flesh areas. I also included shadows around the edges of the sleeve, and I've mixed up a brown colour with plenty of glaze medium for this. I'll probably use 3 coats, drying each coat with a hairdryer between applications. I've sort of blended the brown into the lighter area of skin. You can sort of just peter it out with your brush, or maybe blend with the pure glaze medium that is straight out of the bottle. Then mix some dark red with glaze medium and blend that into the edges of the sleeve. Then darkening down the man's jumper, obviously leaving that highlight area at the top. I also very slightly darken the man's hair at the left, just reinforcing the idea that the light is coming from the top right. All that's left to do is put in a bit of detail around the eye and lips. I can see that's not quite lined up, but you can get the gist. And then there's these stripes, which was a compositional decision, and I kind of think adds a bit of value. Now, back to that bad hair day, I still don't quite like this overall large area. It's not that I'm trying to make it look like hair, and that's an important point. You know it's the woman's hair because it's on top of her head, which is where hair generally lives. What I'm really trying to do is make each and every one of the areas of this painting look like they are interesting colours and fascinating texture. For instance, look at the man's hair. It's blue with a couple of pink bits in it. And if we were to isolate it, it really wouldn't look anything like hair. This is a stylised painting, not a literal one that tries to emulate a scene as exactly as it can. Finding a style is a great trick in painting. It lifts you out of the crowd. But I digress. Back to the bad hair day. Splodge, take that, you toe rag. So yes, this white was applied with just 2 brush strokes using a 3-inch decorator's brush, lightly loaded with paint on the flat side of the brush. Using very minimal amount of brush strokes is another great trick with this sort of painting. Far better than to keep on tickling it with a small brush until it looks just like you've kept on tickling it with a small brush. I then painted over that white area with a couple of coats of lemon yellow mixed with glaze medium and just slightly darkened the bottom left corner in order to sort of frame the picture. Well, that's it really, but do realise that this is not the way to paint in acrylics. It's just a way of painting. There are as many different ways of painting as there are painters, but by looking closely at one particular model, it may just lead you towards a glorious path of your own.